Oggetti socievoli.
Oggetti Socievoli presenta.
A Conversation With is hosted by Priska Arosio.
My name is Anuradha Reddy. That's how I go by professionally. I mean, I guess I could call myself an interdisciplinary designer and researcher in the context of contemporary technologies like the Internet of Things or machine learning and artificial intelligence. And it's largely working in the context of creating or understanding the kind of interactions we develop with these technologies.
So we invited you today because you wrote a thesis, which is called Researching IoT Through Design. So if you can give us a short introduction and then we can start the discussion.
So my thesis, Researching IoT Through Design, is basically a question of how do we actually live with the contemporary technologies. And when I say live, I mean on a daily, everyday basis, where the home becomes quite, it stands out as a part of the way we live with technologies these days, kind of reflecting a little bit on the nature of areas like smart homes, for example, that have been gaining a lot of traction in the last decade or so, and trying to see, okay, then if there are smart homes, then what does it mean to actually be at home with some of these technologies? You know, does home actually mean a house with 4 walls and a roof, or what does it mean when like technologies like IoT kind of flow beyond our home? Like even our Wi-Fi networks actually flow outside our walls. So what does it then mean to be at home in relation to also like particular wearable devices or smartphones, which we kind of take for granted, but you know, even they have the influence of external stakeholders and marketing companies and so on, which, you know, constantly exchange data with us, and often in a way that's always hidden and distributed, which kind of impacts how we think about these devices and how we live with them. That's what my thesis is about, and I kind of take a designerly perspective to this.
How do you define being at home in your dissertation?
That was a very 5-year-long question that I grappled with. So being at home basically is about kind of starting to feel like you develop attachment to things over time. And when you start taking these things for granted, when you start doing things kind of subconsciously alongside these things, you can to some extent say you're starting to feel at home with some of these devices and objects. And here I'm mostly talking about like non-human things and objects, basically anything that's artificially or man-made. The example that I give in my thesis is the IKEA example, where when you actually bring it home and you make it by yourself, you start to feel a certain kind of empowerment, feeling ownership, feeling like you understand its bolts, you know when it's loose, and you start like having a sense of comfort alongside it, you know, have a much closer relationship and attachment to the thing. And that's kind of empowerment angle that I look at.
So you don't look at the home as a fixed location, but you look at more how we relate to the things around us and how things and objects make us feel at home. Did the thesis has a relation with COVID and the pandemic?
Not initially, obviously. I started my thesis in 2015 when we couldn't have even imagined something like this. But towards the end, it became so clear how important my thesis is during the pandemic, increasingly because most people were lacking access to basic things like shelter. At the same time, we were also over-reliant, and as we are now as well, we are over-reliant on some of these technologies to make us connect with each other, have a social life. So these kind of questions became even more prevalent during the pandemic. I hope that my thesis provides some answers, but yeah, of course, it was still very premature given that the pandemic and the thesis defense coincided.
So you bring up a couple of case studies in your thesis, which also show this idea of participation. How do you think this idea of participation is important within the process of designing objects in a home context and also understanding our interaction with the objects and also in relation to IoT perspective?
So one of the reasons why I draw from the notion of participation is because, as with smart homes and most other Internet of Things technologies, a lot of the focus is given on ease of use or how easy it is to use the things. But on the other hand, we actually see that we are not just using things, but we are also actively participating in what things do with other things, or we actively participate in what Amazon does or Facebook does. So participation starts to become more important than ease of use. And that's the kind of hypothesis or the question that I was trying to deal with or tackling being at home through participation. So basically the case study with Stig, okay, so just brief introduction to Stig. So Stig was an elderly street mapper of Malmö. He was about 70 years old and he was one of the top he contributed the most number of images to the improvement of street maps of Malmö at the time. His case is super interesting because he used his mobility scooter. So he was disabled. He had a spinal injury, kind of very creatively put an iPhone rig on his scooter and he would drive everywhere in Malmö. Like if he went to the cinema or if he went to the supermarket, he would map the whole city that way. And it was super fascinating to understand how he does it or why he does it. So through my interactions with him, it became very clear that his participation in OpenStreetMaps was very much related to, one, his sense of service, sense of duty to society, because he was a retired war surgeon. And another thing, he wanted to continue to participate in society in a meaningful way, and he was curious about technology and so on. But in that process, he was also bringing in other kinds of things into his participation. So for example, when he would do street mapping, a lot of the times it was a very intensive process of collecting data, uploading that data to the servers, and also recharging his batteries and so on. So to compensate for this kind of very intense way of working with OpenStreetMaps, he would practice meditation with an oil lamp for about 40 minutes every day. So he started to develop a routine or a habit around it. And similarly, he also kind of compensated for his excessive use of technology because of his issue with a shaky hand, as elderly people often do have that issue. So he used twigs as a way to kind of help him click buttons on his phone and so on. And then he would go around in nature, in the environment, looking for twigs to press buttons on his phone. And that was kind of amusing, but also you can start to see how he was not just using his smartphone application for street maps, but there was an entire ecology of things that were constantly interacting in that kind of situation of compensation with twigs, and then there's the oil meditation and so on. So I think that it's important for us to see how our participation with technology exceeds what we are given in our smartphones or the apps that we are expected to use in a very tailored kind of way. And the more we start looking at participation as a kind of criteria as opposed to ease of use, we start to see that there's so much joy and there's so much variety in the way people interact with things, and everything is just so unique, and it gives you a lot of satisfaction, makes you feel like you're more at home. That's why we need to then say participation instead of use, because we should be the ones who are getting served by technology, but instead it's the other way around.
It's really interesting, this example of Stig, because it shows how much people are lonely and they try to find new ways to communicate with the outside world through technology. I think we could continue the conversation with the pillow experiment and how this shows the interaction between people, objects, and IoT.
The Stig experiment was very, very overwhelming for me as a design researcher. First of all, I was dealing with a person who was elderly, who was also disabled. And it kind of put me in a very difficult position or putting an ethical dilemma on me about deciding what kind of life, is a good life for him. So later in my thesis, I decided maybe I needed to be a little more playful in my approach by, experiments with technology on my own. And one of the approaches that I take in my thesis is to actually make things as if they're participants in my design process. So I give them active, roles in the design process. One way that you can do this is by adding sensors to things. So I try to do this by using a pillow, like just a cushion, and I put a heat sensor inside the pillow, and I connected this to a lamp, and I connected them together. So whenever the pillow would be heated, like whenever it gets warmer, the light also glows brighter. And if there's the pillow kind of cools down, then the light also turns off on its own. And I thought I'll just live with this for a day or two and see what will happen. But what was interesting is that it kind of changed how I behave in the process, and I will explain that. So basically, I tried to have it in the living room, and I was reading a book on the couch, and I had put the pillow behind me, and it kind of got warm. So then there was this lamp next to me, which was also glowing nice and bright, and it was a very cozy, nice experience. And then meanwhile, I thought, okay, maybe I wanted like some tea. So I went into the kitchen, and forgetfully or kind of unconsciously, I just put the pillow on a table, on the coffee table in the living room. And when the water was boiling, I saw that the light was actually dimming down. Then I realized the coffee table was a bit cold. So then the light was dimming down. So then again, unconsciously, I put the pillow back on the couch because the couch still retained my body heat. So it was not just me who was participating in this heat network between me and the pillow and the lamp, but it was also the coffee table, it was also the couch. So this kind of extends the idea of participation when you start paying attention to particular ways in which things behave, and sensors and these kinds of like IoT devices can really help us appreciate things in that way.
How do you think that this research and analysis that you guys, and I say you guys because I think you're part of a larger group of people who are doing research on the subject, how do you think this can go and influence the design process that is already in place today?
I think actively, one of the ways that the approach that I take can help a design process is by kind of taking a step back. When you talk about human-centered design, you can also try and see what it might be like to be a thing, for example. So kind of using these opportunities to, either role play objects, try and see things from a different perspective, foreground the background and background the foreground. And these kind of exercises or methods could actually help us see how things exceed what we think they do. Like, sometimes we think a bottle is just a bottle, but maybe if you saw something from a bottle's perspective, you actually start noticing something else completely. You start seeing perhaps there are different kinds of water networks that this bottle interacts with, and kind of starts giving you a better understanding of non-human agency, which is quite relevant today, I think, in relation to also talking about like the climate crisis and the fact that there's geological devastation and so on. Not really focusing on the human as the ultimate, or the user-centered design, which is the dominant way in which design processes are done these days. I would say maybe these kind of approaches can help us try and see things differently, maybe from different points of view, which gives us a different kind of angle to how we want to design things.
How do you think the pandemic will push the design field to change even further?
I mean, I'm thinking of right now, like people taking a lot more interest in painting or like art and these kind of processes. So I definitely think that like arts and crafts will start intersecting again back with the idea of things and objects at home. Before the pandemic, I feel a lot of things we took for granted. We stopped drawing our everyday objects. But now I think a lot of these processes are coming back in the sense that people are starting to learn how to take joy from the little things that are around them.
So how are you using your living space at home, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
We actually me and my partner, we moved houses during the pandemic, and a lot of design decisions came into our play when we were thinking of how we want to, live in this new house or this new apartment. I actually do have a full-fledged home office behind me where we have a specific room dedicated to our office needs, where we work from home. Like before in my previous apartment, the flow between the office space and the home space was still like a bit fluid, but now it's become much more, because this is where I work. And then the other rooms, I don't use it for work at all. There's this kind of change in the way I like work with objects. And for example, certain things in this room stay in this room. They don't go to the other room. The table that I'm sitting on right now is my work table. The table that you see in the back is my craft table. I have like my sewing machine and so on. So like when I make clothes or when I make other things, I like turn my back. So then there's like, I don't know, there's a lot of like a dichotomy that I'm making, the way I organize my space and so on.
What type of value do you give to objects, and how this has changed during your lockdown experience?
I have always been someone who values objects. I find it difficult to like, throw away anything but before it was a little bit more of kind of a practical decision. Now I'm thinking more like, oh, so I have this shirt that I no longer wear, but now I can also like upcycle it. I can make it into some other kind of like a headband or like, So I start trying to see what I can do with objects, probably because I have become so close to them over time during the pandemic. So I definitely think that's the kind of difference, where my value towards that object has moved from something as being like object and me to something where I can actually change or modify that object to be something else.
What does sociable objects mean to you, or what make you think they were sociable objects?
Yeah, I was thinking about this question about the sociable objects, because initially I thought sociable objects could mean like, behave social, like an Alexa or like a Siri or something. I think the way I understand it more is like when objects enter into your social world and they start becoming part of it. It becomes very difficult, for example, to say who I am without including an object. So that's kind of how I see like sociable objects as kind of being as a part of this assemblage or something.